It was an unusually dreary October afternoon in the city. The rain came in sheets, splattering off sidewalks and blurring the taillights of cars that moved slowly through congested streets. Pedestrians rushed past each other, umbrellas bumping, each trying to stay as dry as possible, and all of it was accompanied by the symphony of car horns and the distant roll of thunder. Alex Harper, a slender woman in her late 20s, pulled her coat tighter as she ran, her shoes splashing through puddles. She was late, which was very unlike her. Punctuality had always been one of her strong suits, a result of years of project deadlines and a need for control in a world that often gave her very little. She knew Daniel Brooks had likely already arrived at the coffee shop, and first impressions mattered. Still, with the downpour, the traffic, and her umbrella refusing to open at the worst possible moment, this afternoon seemed determined to conspire against her. By the time she pushed open the door to Cafe Verona, she was thoroughly soaked, her hair plastered to her forehead. The warm air, tinged with the aroma of roasted coffee and freshly baked pastries, provided a stark contrast to the chill she had brought in with her. She scanned the crowded room quickly, her eyes searching for a face she'd only seen in photographs. Daniel Brooks sat near the back, his attention half focused on the screen of his laptop, half on the window. He was in his early 30s, with neatly combed dark hair and an expression that could only be described as expectant curiosity. Despite the wet weather, he had managed to maintain a polished appearance. Crisp button-down shirt, no tie, but a look that said he belonged in boardrooms and not in a rainstorm. Alex approached the table, her wet sneakers squeaking slightly on the polished wooden floor. She paused just in front of him, shaking droplets from her coat. "Daniel Brooks?" she asked, her voice steady despite her breathlessness. She extended her hand, a hint of a smile on her lips. Daniel looked up, startled for a second. He had expected Alex Harper to be more formal, perhaps. Her soaked state seemed almost at odds with the serious tone of their scheduled meeting. He quickly stood, taking her hand. "That's me. You must be Alex. Please, have a seat." "Thanks," she replied, setting her bag down before easing herself into the chair across from him. She glanced at her reflection in the window and huffed softly at her drenched appearance. "Sorry I'm late. The weather had other plans." He gave a small chuckle, nodding. "Yeah, it's not exactly cooperating today. Don't worry about it." He gestured to the counter. "Can I get you something? Coffee? Tea?" Alex hesitated, then nodded. "A coffee would be great. Black, thanks." Daniel moved towards the counter, leaving Alex to collect herself for a moment. She reached into her bag, pulling out the manila envelope she had carried with her everywhere for the last week. Inside were documents, dangerous documents. She stared at it for a beat, mentally preparing for what she was about to share. Daniel returned shortly, placing a steaming cup in front of her before resuming his seat. "So," Daniel started, glancing curiously at the envelope in front of her. "I have to admit, I'm a bit curious. This whole thing was vague, to say the least. You mentioned something urgent about my company?" Alex took a deep breath. She leaned forward slightly, placing her hand on the envelope. "I know, and I appreciate you coming today despite the mystery. What I'm about to tell you is, well, it's not good news, but I think if we work together, we can make it through." Daniel's brow furrowed, the curiosity shifting into something more cautious, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. "You make it sound serious," he said, his voice lower now, the casual pleasantries from earlier evaporating. "It is," Alex replied. She pushed the envelope toward him. "These documents detail surveillance on you, your employees, and your company for the past year. There's someone, maybe a group, targeting Bridgeworks. This isn't just corporate espionage. It goes deeper. The kind of people behind this, they don't want to just copy your tech. They want control." Daniel's face changed, the color draining slightly. He opened the envelope, pulling out a few of the pages, his eyes skimming over the financial records, the printed emails, photographs taken from outside his office. He swallowed hard, a look of disbelief in his eyes. "This is," he started, shaking his head, "this is insane. Who could have gotten this close without us knowing?" Alex sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I can't tell you all the details right now. Not here. But I have a network of contacts, people who understand how to get this kind of information. Let's just say I know enough to be very worried. They're not just interested in your software, Daniel. They're interested in you." Daniel looked up, meeting her gaze. The worry in his eyes was hard to hide. But why? I mean, we're just developing AI. We're not dealing in defense or anything that should be threatening enough to warrant this. Exactly, Alex said, her eyes intense. It's not about what you're developing right now. It's about what they think you could develop in the future. Someone out there thinks Bridgeworks is going to be a threat to their plans, and they're ready to act now before you even get there. Daniel rubbed his temples, trying to process it all. He let out a deep breath. I don't even know where to start. How can I trust you? You could be part of this for all I know. Alex smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. You can't trust me. Not fully. Not yet. But you can trust that I'm the only person showing you the truth right now. And I'm offering to help. We're on the same side, Daniel, even if you're not sure of that yet. There was a long pause. Daniel studied her, trying to decide if she was someone he could rely on. The envelope in his hand seemed heavy, and he knew that whatever choice he made now could change everything about his future. Finally, he nodded. All right, Alex, let's say I believe you. What's next? Alex relaxed, if only a little. She leaned forward again, her voice barely above a whisper. We go off the grid. No phone calls, no emails. We're going to dig deep, but quietly. And I promise you, we will get to the bottom of this. Daniel nodded, a determined glint in his eyes despite the storm of uncertainty inside him. Okay, he said. I'm in. The two sat in silence for a moment, the sound of rain against the window the only thing filling the air. Alex took her coffee, sipping it slowly, her eyes never leaving Daniel's. She knew they were about to embark on a dangerous path, one that could cost them both dearly. But she also knew it was the only path that could possibly lead to the truth. And as the rain continued to fall outside, washing the city in shades of gray, Alex and Daniel made a silent pact. Two strangers brought together by a dangerous truth that neither of them could afford to ignore. The next day, Daniel sat in his office, an expansive space on the 18th floor of a high-rise downtown. The room was bathed in natural light from the floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the busy streets below. The view was typically something he found calming, an assurance that his company was at the heart of a thriving metropolis. But today, the feeling was different. Yesterday's conversation with Alex kept replaying in his mind. Every word, every page in that envelope, each implication heavier than the last. He had spent the night trying to piece it all together. Bridgeworks wasn't just his company. It was his vision, his creation. It wasn't supposed to be the target of corporate sabotage or intrigue. He had built his business with a belief in technology as a force for good, a way to solve problems. But now it seemed someone had a much darker purpose in mind. His assistant, Claire, knocked on his office door and peeked inside. Mr. Brooks, there's someone here to see you. She says her name is Alex. Daniel nodded, his expression betraying no surprise. Send her in, Claire, and hold my calls. Claire nodded and stepped back out. A moment later, Alex walked in. She was dressed more sharply today, fitted black jeans, a charcoal blazer, and ankle boots. It was a clear contrast to her appearance yesterday in the rain. There was a certain deliberateness to her look, as if she wanted to convey she meant business. Daniel gestured to the chair across from his desk. Have a seat, he said. Alex took her place, placing her slim laptop bag beside her chair. She studied Daniel for a moment. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept much. She wasn't surprised. She had seen that look before in people she'd worked with, those facing impossible choices. So you're here again, Daniel said, giving her a thin smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. I've been thinking about what you told me, and I'm not going to lie, Alex. I'm still not sure if I should be trusting you. Fair enough, Alex replied. She leaned back in her chair, seemingly unfazed. Trust takes time, especially with something like this. But I came today because I think we're running out of time. Daniel nodded, his expression softening just slightly. Go on. Alex opened her laptop, turning it slightly so Daniel could see. I did some more digging last night. You see this? She pointed to a folder filled with documents and surveillance photos. I've managed to trace some of the surveillance activities to an entity that has connections to a company named Aegis Dynamics. It's a shell corporation. They're offloading the tech they steal to some third parties. And trust me, these aren't people we want to have your technology. Daniel's eyebrows furrowed as he examined the screen. Aegis Dynamics. I've never heard of them. Why go through all this trouble to steal from me? There are bigger companies, more powerful targets. Alex shook her head. It's not about size, Daniel. It's about what you're developing, the AI security applications. Think about it. Your AI isn't just about basic security, it's about predictive measures. Whoever has control of this technology can manipulate data, predict outcomes, and control systems. Imagine what someone with a hidden agenda could do with that power. Daniel sighed deeply, leaning back in his chair. He rubbed his face with his hands, taking a moment to gather his thoughts. Finally, he looked at her. So what's your angle, Alex? You just show up with all this information. And now what? What do you want out of this? Alex leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. I'm here because I want to make sure this tech doesn't fall into the wrong hands. Look, I've seen things like this before. Projects go missing, only to show up being used for all the wrong reasons. I know how these groups operate. You need someone who understands that, who can help protect you and your work. Daniel gave her a skeptical look. And what makes you think you're the one to do that? Because, she said simply, I'm good at finding things people want hidden. And because I believe in what you're doing. I think your technology can genuinely make a difference. And I'd rather see it in the hands of someone who knows how to use it responsibly than someone who wants to weaponize it. Daniel leaned back, considering her words. You know, most people, if they were in your shoes, would have sold this information off for a profit or blackmailed me. Why are you willing to stick your neck out for me instead? A small smile crossed Alex's face, one that had a hint of sadness in it. Maybe because I've seen too many good people lose their work, lose their lives, because of people like this. I don't want to be a part of that. I don't want to stand on the sidelines and watch someone's dream get twisted into something dark. She paused, her expression hardening. And I think I've been on the sidelines for long enough. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood and walked to the window, staring out at the city below. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him, every nerve screaming at him to be careful. After a moment, he turned back to face her. All right, let's say I agree. Let's say I let you help. What exactly are you offering, Alex? What's your plan? Alex nodded, sensing a shift. She turned her laptop back towards herself, bringing up a new screen. The first thing we need to do is establish a secure way to communicate. No more emails, no texts. I've got a secure server we can use, but it's better if we meet in person until we know just how far they've infiltrated your network. And after that, Daniel asked, his tone tinged with determination. We start identifying who's behind Aegis Dynamics, Alex said. We find out who's pulling the strings, who's financing them, and how they're getting your tech. Once we have that, we can decide how to take them down. Daniel studied her, the concern in his eyes slowly giving way to resolve. You make it sound so simple, Alex shrugged. It's not. It's dangerous. There's no guarantee we'll come out of this unscathed, but it's better than doing nothing and watching everything you've built fall apart, right? Daniel nodded, finally extending his hand across the desk. All right, Alex, I'm in. Let's do this. Alex reached across and shook his hand firmly. You won't regret it. But remember, this isn't just about protecting your company. It's about making sure no one gets hurt, including you. Daniel nodded, appreciating her candor. He looked at her, and for the first time, he felt something other than fear since their first meeting. He felt hope. Let's get started then, Daniel said. And with those words, an unexpected partnership was forged, a partnership that would put them both to the test in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The following morning, Daniel Brooks sat at his desk, his eyes glued to the document Alex had given him the previous day. The sun was shining through his office windows, bathing the room in golden light, but it did little to ease the unease in his chest. He knew today was the start of something entirely different for him, something that had nothing to do with investors, board meetings, or developing technology. Today, he would be fighting back. The knock at his door was soft, almost hesitant, but Daniel had been waiting for it. He turned his head towards the door. Come in. Alex stepped into the office, dressed in dark jeans and a fitted leather jacket, her face focused and serious. She was carrying a small, sleek backpack slung over one shoulder and had a determined set to her expression. Morning, Daniel, she said, giving him a nod as she approached his desk. Ready to get started? Daniel leaned back in his chair, studying her. Ready as I'll ever be, he replied. I'm not going to lie, Alex. This feels out of my depth. Alex gave him a small, reassuring smile. That's normal. If you didn't feel a bit out of your depth, I'd be worried. But trust me, we'll take it one step at a time. Today's about setting up the basics, our security, our new routines, and most importantly, how we make ourselves invisible. Daniel frowned slightly. Invisible? Alex nodded. Yep. Look, right now, we need to assume that everything is compromised. Your emails, phone calls, even your office space. We're going dark, which means cutting off any easy surveillance. No more standard communication channels. Daniel rubbed his chin, considering. And you think they've already breached all those channels? It's highly likely, Alex said. The kind of operation they're running, they're going to want as much intel as possible. We need to start working with encrypted devices. I brought you something. She opened her backpack and pulled out a small black rectangular box. Daniel leaned forward, his eyes curious. What's that? Alex placed the box on the desk and opened it. Inside were two phones, sleek and unbranded, without the typical logos or markings. These are secure phones. They use end-to-end encryption. No apps, no GPS, no typical features. These are strictly for communication between you and me. Daniel picked one up, turning it over in his hand. Feels different, almost like a burner phone. Alex nodded. Basically, that's what it is, but this one is much harder to track or tap. And remember, no calls or messages that aren't urgent, and keep conversations brief. We don't want anyone picking up on patterns. Daniel sighed, setting the phone down. All right, so new phones. Anything else? Yes, Alex replied, reaching into her bag once more. She pulled out a thin metal card about the size of a credit card and handed it to him. This is your new security key. We'll use this to access any documents or systems that we don't want compromised. It generates a new password every 30 seconds. You'll need this for logging into the secure server I set up. Daniel took the card, examining it. A security key, encrypted phones, this is all starting to feel like a spy movie, he said with a nervous chuckle. Alex's expression softened slightly. I get it. This is a lot, and it's not what you signed up for. But we have to be cautious. The people we're dealing with are not going to play fair. Daniel nodded, his demeanor turning serious. I understand. I'm just trying to wrap my head around all of it. Alex smiled. One day at a time, Daniel. Today, we're just focusing on getting our tools in place. Once that's done, we start gathering information. Daniel took a deep breath. Okay, so where do we start? How do we find these people? Alex looked at him, her gaze unwavering. We start by looking at your company from the outside in. I need you to think about everyone who's had access to your core tech in the last 2 years. Partners, investors, even employees. Who's had the opportunity to get close? Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly as he thought about her words. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers on the desk. Well, there's our main investor, Richard Klein. He's been with us since the early stages, and he's had access to almost everything. Alex nodded, making a note on her tablet. All right, and employees? Daniel sighed. That's harder. I trust my core team, but I guess there's always room for doubt. We've grown a lot in the last year. There are a lot of new faces. Good, Alex said. That's where we'll start. We're going to go through the list of people who have access to sensitive information, one by one. We'll see if anyone's behavior has changed or if there are any red flags. Daniel frowned slightly, the realization of what they were about to do hitting him. We're investigating my people, aren't we? Alex met his gaze, her expression somber. We are. I know it's not an easy thing to do, but it's necessary. If we don't find the leak, they'll keep coming for you. Daniel sighed deeply, the weight of the situation settling in. He picked up the security key, feeling its cold surface against his palm, and looked up at Alex. All right, he said, his voice steady. Let's do this. Alex nodded, her eyes reflecting a mix of determination and empathy. We'll find out who's behind this, Daniel. I promise you that. Daniel looked at her, a hint of gratitude in his eyes. Thank you, Alex. I don't know what I'd do without you right now. Alex smiled, a real one this time, full of warmth. You're not alone in this. We'll figure it out together. And remember, this is just the first step. Once we know who's behind it, we can figure out how to stop them. Daniel nodded, the fear that had gripped him beginning to ease just slightly. All right, let's get to work. Alex stood, slinging her backpack over her shoulder. "I've got a list of people we can start looking into. I'll go through the preliminary data and let you know what I find. In the meantime, use the secure phone for any communication and don't trust anything or anyone you don't have to." Daniel watched as she turned to leave, her confidence an anchor for his nerves. Before she walked out the door, he called out to her. "Alex?" She paused, turning back towards him. "Be careful out there," he said. His voice was sincere, the concern evident. She smiled. "You too, Daniel. We're in this together." With that, she left, the door closing softly behind her. Daniel looked down at the secure phone in his hand, the weight of it feeling heavier than it should. He knew they were heading into dangerous waters, but for the first time, he felt like they had a plan, like they were making progress. He took a deep breath, set his shoulders, and turned back to his computer. It was time to fight back, one careful step at a time. It was past midnight, and the rain was relentless, drumming heavily on the roof of the small rented van. The parking lot was nearly deserted, just an expanse of gravel and puddles reflecting the dim, flickering lights of the industrial buildings beyond. Daniel sat in the back of the van, feeling a growing unease. His fingers tapped nervously against his knee as he watched Alex work on her laptop, her face illuminated by the screen's cold blue glow. Alex had driven them out to the industrial outskirts of the city, to a section of town where rows of warehouses lined silent, dark streets. It was an area Daniel had never been to, and certainly not at this time of night. It was supposed to be a covert operation, just the two of them, no backup, no room for error. "Are you sure this is the right place?" Daniel asked, his voice just loud enough to be heard over the sound of the rain. He leaned forward, trying to get a glimpse of the laptop screen. Alex nodded, not looking up from her work. "This is it. The signal we traced from your server is being routed through here. There's no doubt about it." She pointed at a black and white surveillance feed on her laptop, showing the inside of one of the warehouses. Men in dark uniforms were moving around inside, moving crates and checking equipment. They moved with a sense of purpose, like they knew exactly what they were doing. Daniel frowned, staring at the screen. "And you think that's my tech?" "I know it is," Alex said. She zoomed in on a crate, revealing a logo Daniel knew all too well. It was his own. His heart sank, a deep frustration building in his chest. "They're either storing it here or modifying it before sending it somewhere else. But this is definitely Bridgeworks tech." Daniel rubbed his temples, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "So, what's the plan? We can't just go in there and demand it back." Alex smirked, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "Definitely not. But we don't need to be loud to get what we want." She reached over to her bag and pulled out a pair of small earpieces. Handing one to Daniel, she explained, "We're going to get closer, but we're not going in guns blazing. We're just gathering intel. We need to figure out how far this goes and who's really behind it. You put this in, and we'll be able to communicate even if we're separated." Daniel took the earpiece and nodded, inserting it carefully. He wasn't used to this type of cloak and dagger work. He had always been more comfortable behind a desk or in a lab. But seeing his technology in the wrong hands stirred something inside him, a need to take control of the situation. "All right," Daniel said, his voice steadier now. "What do we do?" Alex looked at him, her gaze sharp. "We move quietly. We're going to slip into that building and plant a device on their network. If we can get access to their server, I can start figuring out exactly who's running this operation." "Plant a device?" Daniel repeated, eyebrows raised. "You mean, like, hack them?" Alex smiled. "Exactly. It's the fastest way to get answers." Daniel swallowed, the gravity of their actions weighing heavily on him. "And if we get caught?" "We won't," Alex said firmly, her eyes meeting his. "I won't let that happen. Just follow my lead." She reached into her backpack and pulled out 2 dark, waterproof jackets. She tossed one to Daniel. "Put this on. We're going to get wet." Daniel slipped on the jacket, taking a deep breath. "Let's do it." The two of them slipped out of the van, the rain instantly soaking into their clothing despite the jackets. They moved quickly, but quietly, crouching low as they approached the chain-link fence that surrounded the warehouse. Alex pulled out a small pair of wire cutters, expertly creating a gap just big enough for them to crawl through. Daniel followed her, his heart pounding as they stepped onto the property. He could see the dark figures of the guards patrolling near the main entrance, and they moved around the side of the building, sticking to the shadows. Alex pointed to a side door, a dim light above it, the only indication it was even there. She turned to Daniel, whispering, "This is it. There shouldn't be anyone near this entrance. Just stay close." Daniel nodded, feeling the adrenaline rush through his veins. He kept close behind Alex as she approached the door, pulling out a device that looked like a smartphone. She held it up to the keypad beside the door, and after a few seconds, the lock clicked open. They slipped inside, the heavy door closing quietly behind them. The air was damp, filled with the smell of oil and dust. The building was dimly lit, with only a few overhead lights casting long shadows along the concrete floor. Alex motioned for Daniel to follow her to a corner of the warehouse, away from the main area where the workers were moving crates. She pulled out a small cylindrical device, handing it to Daniel. "This is the transponder. All you have to do is attach it to one of their main server terminals. It'll piggyback on their signal and give me remote access." Daniel took the device, feeling the cool metal against his palm. "You make it sound easy," he said, his voice low. "It is," Alex replied with a smirk. "Just don't drop it." They crept forward, using the large crates for cover. They moved carefully, avoiding the open areas, the echoes of voices and machinery reverberating through the space. Daniel's pulse quickened every time they moved, each step feeling like a gamble. Finally, they reached the server room, a small glass-walled space at the back of the warehouse. Alex checked her surroundings, then slipped inside. She gestured for Daniel to follow, closing the door behind them. "Okay," she whispered, pointing to a terminal at the far end of the room. "That's our target." Daniel nodded and moved towards the terminal. His breath held as he attached the device to the back of the machine. A small green light blinked on, indicating it was connected. "Good job," Alex said, her voice coming through his earpiece. "Now, let's get out of here." Suddenly, the door to the server room swung open, and a guard stepped in, his flashlight sweeping across the room. Daniel froze, his heart leaping into his throat. The guard's flashlight beam fell on Daniel, and the guard's eyes widened. "Hey, you're not supposed to be here." Before Daniel could react, Alex moved swiftly, pulling a small stun gun from her jacket pocket. She pressed it against the guard's neck, and he crumpled to the floor without a sound. Daniel stared, wide-eyed. "Alex, what?" "No time." She cut him off, her voice urgent. "We need to move, now." They slipped out of the server room, Alex leading the way. She moved with a practiced ease, her steps confident as they made their way back towards the side door. The sound of footsteps and shouting echoed through the warehouse. Someone had noticed the guard was down. They reached the door, slipping out into the rain-soaked night. Alex gestured towards the gap in the fence, and they crawled through it, making their way back to the van as quickly as possible. Daniel's heart was pounding, every nerve on edge. They climbed into the van, slamming the doors behind them. Alex immediately started the engine, pulling out of the lot and speeding down the dark, empty street. It wasn't until they were a few blocks away that Daniel finally allowed himself to breathe. He looked at Alex, his hands trembling slightly. "That was intense," he said, his voice shaky. Alex glanced at him, her eyes softening slightly. "I know, but you did good, Daniel. We got what we needed." Daniel nodded, still trying to calm his racing heart. He looked at the transponder, its green light blinking steadily. "So, now what?" "Now," Alex said, her voice calm but determined, "we find out exactly who's behind all this." Daniel leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes for a moment. He knew they weren't safe yet, far from it. But for the first time, it felt like they were making progress, like they were finally starting to get some answers. "Thanks, Alex," he said, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. "I wouldn't be able to do this without you." Alex smiled, her eyes focused on the road ahead. "You're not alone in this, Daniel. We're just getting started." And as they drove into the night, the weight of their actions settled between them, a shared burden, but also a shared purpose. They were ready to face whatever shadows awaited them, together. It was early evening, and Daniel found himself pacing his small apartment, the sound of rain once again pattering against the window. The events of the previous night had left him on edge, adrenaline still coursing through his veins. It had been the first time he'd ever done something so dangerous, and the gravity of what they were up against weighed heavily on him. On his desk lay Alex's secure laptop, blinking occasionally to signal its encrypted connection. He knew the transponder they had planted was working. It was transmitting data right now, streaming everything that it could from the warehouse's server. He just didn't know what they'd find, or what it would mean for them moving forward. A knock at the door startled Daniel out of his thoughts. He moved cautiously toward the door, looking through the peephole. It was Alex. He quickly unlocked the door and let her in, her figure instantly drenched from the downpour outside. "Got caught in the rain again, I see," Daniel said, a small smile tugging at his lips as he handed her a towel. Alex smirked, taking the towel and wiping her face and hair. "You seem to have a knack for picking rainy days for all our covert operations, Daniel." She set her bag on the table and pulled out her laptop. "Are you ready?" she asked, her expression turning serious. Daniel nodded, moving to sit next to her. "Yeah, let's see what we got." Alex opened the laptop, quickly typing in her credentials. The screen loaded to reveal a series of encrypted files, data collected from the server at the warehouse. She opened the first one, and rows of code and numbers scrolled by. Daniel leaned in closer, his eyes scanning the data. "Do you see anything yet?" he asked. Alex's eyes narrowed, her fingers moving quickly across the keys. "Not yet, but this is definitely their financial data. If we can follow the money, we'll know who's funding this whole operation." Daniel watched as she opened more files, each one revealing something different: shipping manifests, inventory lists, communications logs. Suddenly, Alex paused, her gaze fixed on the screen. "Wait, look at this." She enlarged an image, a scanned document. It was a list of names, each one accompanied by a series of numbers and addresses. Daniel's eyes widened as he read through the list. These are our clients," he said, his voice full of disbelief. "They have our client list." Alex nodded, her expression hardening. "Not just your clients. Look at the annotations next to each one." Daniel squinted, leaning in to see the tiny text beside each name. Words like targeted, contact made, and high value were scribbled in the margins. He swallowed hard, a cold realization washing over him. They're targeting our clients. They're using our tech to manipulate them. Alex nodded, her fingers pausing for a moment. "And look here, this is a communication log between their operatives and someone named Aegis Prime. It's encrypted, but I think we can crack it if we work at it." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Whoever this Aegis Prime is, they're the ones calling the shots." "Exactly," Alex said, her eyes meeting his. "This is the turning point, Daniel. We know who's behind this, at least partly. Now we need to find out where they are and what they're planning next." Daniel took a deep breath, feeling a mix of relief and trepidation. They had come so far, and finally, they had a lead, a real name. But this also meant that they were running out of time. Whoever Aegis Prime was, they weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. Suddenly, a message appeared on Alex's screen, a notification from the transponder device. She frowned, clicking on it. The message opened to reveal a series of alerts. Security protocols had been triggered at the warehouse. "They know," she said, her voice tense. "They know someone's breached their network." Daniel's heart sank. "What does that mean for us?" "It means we're on borrowed time," Alex said, her eyes flicking up to meet his. "They're going to try to track us. We need to move fast if we're going to stay ahead of them." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, the weight of the situation hitting him all over again. "So, what do we do now? How do we fight back?" Alex paused, considering for a moment. She looked at Daniel, her eyes full of determination. "We're going to take this information and go public. We need to expose them before they have a chance to cover their tracks. If we can show the world what's happening, who's behind it, they won't be able to operate in the shadows anymore." Daniel's eyes widened slightly. "Go public? You mean, like, to the press?" "Yes," Alex said, nodding. "The press, regulators, anyone who can make enough noise to bring them down. We have to put them on the defensive." Daniel hesitated, the risks running through his mind. If they went public, there would be consequences, not just for them, but for Bridgeworks, for his employees, for their entire operation. But he also knew Alex was right. This was bigger than just him or his company. If they didn't stop Aegis Dynamics, countless people could be at risk. He looked at Alex, his resolve hardening. "All right, let's do it. But we have to be careful. We can't afford any mistakes." Alex smiled, her expression softening slightly. We'll be careful, Daniel. I promise, but this is the right move. We have to let people know what's really going on. Daniel nodded, a sense of purpose settling in his chest. He knew there was no turning back now. They had to expose the truth, no matter what it cost them. Alex leaned back, closing the laptop and slipping it into her bag. She looked at Daniel, her eyes filled with a mix of determination and empathy. You're doing the right thing, Daniel. You're fighting for what you believe in. Daniel smiled, though it was tinged with anxiety. I just hope we're ready for whatever comes next. Alex nodded. We will be. And remember, you're not in this alone. We're in this together. Daniel met her gaze, feeling the strength of her conviction. For the first time since this all began, he felt like they were no longer just reacting. They were taking control. Alex stood, grabbing her bag. I'm going to reach out to some contacts, people I know who can help us get this information to the right channels. You should prepare your team, Daniel. They need to know what's coming. Daniel stood as well, a determined look on his face. I'll take care of it. We're not backing down. Alex smiled, giving him a small nod before turning and heading for the door. She paused, looking back at him. Stay safe, Daniel. We're going to get through this. He nodded, watching as she stepped out into the rain, disappearing into the night. Daniel stood there for a moment, taking in a deep breath, the weight of their mission heavy on his shoulders. He knew that this was the turning point, the moment when everything shifted, when they took their stand against the forces trying to tear them down. And no matter what happened, he was ready to see it through to the end. Daniel turned back to his desk, his eyes scanning the room. He knew there was a storm coming, but he also knew that they had come too far to turn back now. It was time to fight.